Also said that in a world where we're going to have thousands, potentially millions of agents, we need to really think about how we orchestrate these, not
Yeah.
only orchestrate these agents, but also how do we actually give them the right information, the context, so they can actually do their job well.
Yeah.
So what the Agentic Knowledge Fabric does, it treats context as an engineered product. It's not
Yeah.
just retrieval, it's a whole end-to-end system for producing predictable, bounded context in a token-aware fashion.
Eric, it's good to see you again. I'm recording this podcast in your hometown of Toronto this week.
Fantastic.
We got a heat wave in San Francisco, so it's good to be here. We got a snow wave here, I guess. Anyway, I'm looking forward to this episode because we're going to come back to this concept that we've been talking about, and at least deeply in the last episode, of the Agentic Knowledge Fabric. And we're going to talk about how we think about it, how we describe components of that, and the process by which information turns into knowledge and gets served into a context. Oh my goodness, I really love this stuff. So, where do you want to start? Do you want to start with defining some terms, or would you like to just remind us why this is so important? Where do you want to start?
Sure. Well, why don't we start with some very simple uh, context, no pun intended, context
Yes.
setting here. So in previous episodes, we've talked about agentic process automation. We've also said that in a world where we're going to have thousands, potentially millions of agents, we need to really think about how we orchestrate these, not
Yeah.
only orchestrate these agents, but also how do we actually give them the right information, the context, so they can actually do their job well. So what the Agentic Knowledge Fabric does, it treats context as an engineered product. It's not just retrieval, it's a whole end-to-end system for producing predictable, bounded context in a token-aware fashion. That's the key thing.
Yeah.
That links together stable identifiers, provenance, and deterministic assembly. So a lot of stuff to digest, but in a 30-second, maybe 60-second brief, that's what it is.
Okay, good. And so let me just remind myself and listeners that the agentic mesh is the ecosystem. And we've been talking about how do those millions of agents work in that ecosystem. The process, agentic process automation, was how do you implement a business process in the agentic mesh? And then if you're going to run a business process and little agents need knowledge when they're running parts of the process, how do we feed them the knowledge they need? And so that's what we're talking about, the knowledge fabric. And I make fun of our acronyms all the time. So teach us, good sir, what are the semantics? How do we define the pieces and parts that make up the knowledge fabric?
Sure. Well, the semantics for agent context generation, effectively what that says is an agent and generating its context cannot be done well unless it understands the semantics of your business. Now, how do we actually do that? So we have that bundle under the Agentic Knowledge Fabric that contains, it's a repository that contains the semantics of your business. So if we break that down into a few, digestible chunks, under semantics, we may think about things like a vocabulary or a taxonomy or an ontology. For storage of that information, we may actually look at knowledge graphs or relational or vector databases. For retrieval, we probably want to have links to where the data actually is and access mechanisms to go get it. But underneath this, there's a foundation of concepts, the nouns, the facts in the business, and the policies, the decision boundaries, the ifs and else, the exceptions that actually define how a business actually runs. So that's what's actually in the agentic knowledge fabric that provides the semantics for agent context generation.
Okay, good. Now that you've laid it out and it relates to this diagram that we're sharing, I think one of the things that I was want to remind myself of and listeners is that what's the difference between knowledge that the agent already knows because it's an LLM? It knows a lot and it's been trained on the interweb, right? It knows a lot versus the problem we're trying to solve, I think, is more about that corpus of knowledge, like we used to call it in the olden days, about the business itself that's specific to that enterprise that's running agents. And that's what we're talking about, that proprietary knowledge that's local to that business, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you said, LLM's trained on everything that's more or less public knowledge. The stuff that's in your business, your standard operating procedures, the requirements documents for projects, emails, Slack messages, whatever, that stuff is hidden behind, hopefully, hidden behind your firewall and is not publicly available. So the question really is, how do I get that information complementing the public information that the LM has, but how do I actually provide that information to the agent? And that's what's called the context. So
Yeah.
really, the key thing we're trying to provide is knowledge in the broadest sense, the concepts and the policies that run the business to the agent so it can most effectively do its job.
Yeah. What does it need to know when it's put in this situation so that it can take the next step or execute an action? And we've talked about all of the components on this slide many times before, but this is the first time I feel like we've put it all in one place so you can understand when we use the term vocabulary. Well, this is where it fits. A vocabulary is specific to a domain. It's the words that were the approved words we're allowed to use. I think we talked about controlled vocabularies and on controlled ontologies from the American Medical Association, for example. It's a great example. They use very specific words to say very precise and specific things. And the words they use, those vocabularies, the structure of the taxonomy, the parent child relationship between those concepts, and everything related to that ontology is well defined. And we're just saying that that's one piece of the puzzle. And
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, I just love seeing it all together. I'm a visual guy, and so I know our producers are going to find a way to
Yeah,
show this thing as we talk about it. But it really it ties it all. The rug that ties the room together. This really ties the room together.
I love it. But you know what? Why don't we make it a little bit more practical and real for our
Yes.
audience? So let's define what these things actually are. At a high level, the vocabulary is the shared terms, the,
Yeah.
the, the nouns that we actually use when we describe our business. The taxonomy is the hierarchical classification of those those terms. Then what we have is the ontologies that add a level of relationships, rich relationships, and rules that bind those elements in the taxonomy together. So it's actually quite important. So if you look at like customer, probably the most intuitively obvious example. So somebody may define a customer as an entity that's completed one purchase. Another one might define a customer as a prospect, an entity that has expressed interest but not purchased. I know I've gone through those discussions many times in the past. So the vocabulary hopefully defines the terms prospect, for example, and customer in a meaningful way that's intuitively obvious that they're different. Now, the taxonomy adds a hierarchy to the vocabulary. So the customer may sit in an organization. Okay. It may be a customer, a small business type customer. It may be a small business customer in Canada versus the United States, or maybe both. So the key here is that the customer has a hierarchy of definitions that allow it to be much more expressive. Now, the ontology brings relationships or rules or constraints on top of those things. So, for example, we may say that a customer has one or more accounts. We can say that a customer is assigned to exactly one sales region. A customer may hold zero or more contracts, or maybe they're inactive if they haven't done anything for 12 months. So these are the kind of the constraints or rules around that data. And that's how these things are actually interrelated. But our proposition here is each of those three things are first-class citizens in the agentic knowledge fabric, and they serve related but specific purposes, John.
Okay. So I think we drained that one. Let's talk about the next couple of buckets that we've got here. Storage and knowledge graphs and indices and metadata. This is a topic that we in the data world spend a lot of time, and folks in the knowledge management world have taught us a lot about how to think about these things. Do you want to run through those two components?
Yeah, sure. I think these are relatively easy to understand, but there's obviously a lot of technical complexity behind these. And the simple thing is you may want to reach out to an expert to actually implement these things properly. So a knowledge graph tries to, well, effectively it's a network of entities. So it visualizes nodes on a graph, and then the relationships between the nodes would be the edges, the lines that join those nodes. Now, the power of this is, in contrast to other techniques, RAG, for example, where you create embeddings, and then you search on similarity for those embeddings. What the knowledge graph does differently is it actually lets you track the relationships between entities to get to the most relevant information. The proposition is those linkages are the most relevant parts of that relationship. Now, there's other ways. I mentioned one, RAG, vector database. There's other ways you can actually store this information. So knowledge graph is one mechanism. I don't want to downplay vector databases. They actually have a meaningful role, and they should be one of the tools in the arsenal for the agentic knowledge fabric. And then there's obviously relational databases. There's some things that can be stored and should be stored in a relational database. So not one size fits all. You may have depending on the type of your data, you may have a predisposition to knowledge graphs or otherwise. But these are really the storage opportunities that you have available to yourself.
There's one thing that I think I've encountered in my data life that always seems to come up, which is this idea that there's knowledge of the customer that requires historical analysis. And we typically put that in a customer profile. And we delineate that between a customer profile that we generated last night and one that we're updating in real time. And that's just sort of a practical implementation thing. And I just want to say it out loud that that kind of storage decision, do you maintain it in real time or in a profile that gets updated, in a micro batch? That whole aspect of the technical discussion around knowledge is important, but not relevant as we talk about the knowledge fabric now. When we start to talk about the process, I think we'll get into more of those questions about how does data flow from source into the agent. And so that's where we'll talk about it. Yeah.
I do want to talk a little bit about the retrieval aspect
Okay.
of it. So just real quickly, um, in general, when I look at the agentic knowledge fabric, it's effectively a set of indexes, and the data resides book of record, in analytical databases, wherever the case may be, but the data resides in the business. So the key here is to bring credibility to the information that we store. You need to have provenance, links to where this data came from. You also have to complement that with access mechanisms so that I can actually reach out when I find a concept for a customer. If I want to find the customer for John Miller or Eric Broda, I need to find that instance, the John Miller customer instance or Eric Broda instance. So there's access mechanisms that allow you to actually get the data so that you can actually serve it to the agent, which
Yeah.
does lead us to the next stage around this, the process, actually.
Yeah. Well, and, I think we're both fans of the word provenance, and I can't thank knowledge management people enough for teaching us how to delineate between this concept of provenance and lineage. And so I just know that if our here using our terms here, if our vocabulary, or if you're working with AI, please talk to your data governance or knowledge management or information architect, because they've been using these terms forever. And it's extremely important that we reuse the same terms to the best that we can when we're talking about um, all of this stuff, because provenance is how we build knowledge. We need to build on
Yeah,
something that has been certified as some sort of ground truth and built upon. So anyway, don't want to get too locked into that thing, but provenance is important.
yeah, but I think you're highlighting something also is you don't have to start from scratch on your
Yeah.
vocabulary, taxonomy, or ontology. Um, there's obviously not going to be a complete ontology for your business. But there's going to be a great starting point. As we said, the phrase we use is we want to stand on the shoulders of giants so we can see far distances. We want to leverage the capability that smart folks have done before. And here's the thing: there's lots of stuff that'll get you, maybe not 80% of the way, but probably 50% of the way that you really ought to be considering.
Yeah. And everything we've said has been said before. So anyway, maybe not in the same context. Haha. Let's finish the AKF, the Agentic Knowledge Fabric slide, and describe what we mean between concepts and policies.
Yeah, this one's actually relatively simple. I don't want to
Yeah.
repeat myself, but I suspect I will. The concepts are when you talk about your business, whether you talk to a customer, a colleague, boss, supervisor, whatever the case may be, these would be the nouns or facts in your business. So I come from financial services, and we always talk about customers, products, and accounts being kind of the joining between a customer and a product. There's a whole bunch of others in financial service, but these are the nouns, the concepts that we actually speak about on a daily basis. The policies are the rules that define, what constitutes a customer. Are they inactive or active, as I mentioned earlier in the ontology discussion? It's the if then else. It's, if we can't get a driver's license to validate their identity, maybe we have a rule that allows us to escalate to something else, maybe a passport. If we haven't got that, maybe there's another rule that we use. So the policies that run the business are almost always overlooked. We believe strongly that policies are, just like concepts, are first-class citizens in the agentic knowledge fabric.
Bingo, which is what we spent an episode talking about. We talked about why it's important to separate the idea of a concept and a policy. So we don't need to say any more about that. So let's switch gears and talk about the second part of the process around how do you get data in, or ingestion? How do you compile it and prepare it for serving to the thing on the far right there, which is the agent? So this is all the stuff that goes behind the scenes so that the agent can know. So, do you want to take us through the story?
Yeah, sure. I think the first thing I would say is there's two parts to the story. There's the offline part, and then there's the online part, to use those terms. So the offline part is where we ingest content and we compile it into concept cards and policy cards. So this is a part that may happen obviously on a regular basis. It may happen whenever you're using event streaming, whenever something new or something of interest actually occurs. This process may take place. But when you think about ingestion, we're talking about much more than what you may initially start with. So yes, you want to look at the metadata and the stuff in your regular data sources, your Snowflake or your Postgres or Oracle or even the mainframe. So there's structured data sources, but there's also a bunch of unstructured stuff. So standard operating procedures that may be in Word documents or something like that. You may have audio and video, maybe stuff from your contact center around customer calls that you may want to actually take a look at. You may have stuff on Google Drives or SharePoint that maybe your requirements document, that document how the system's supposed to work. Maybe we can actually reuse that information. Emails, Slack messages, all those things are crucial. There's also, by the way, public information. So regulatory filings, rules and regulations, GDPR, lots of stuff that's available in the public domain. Then the one that I want to kind of highlight, John, is this whole notion of tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is stuff that's stuck in an expert's head and is very difficult to extract. Now, here's the thing, is techniques today, modern techniques, LLMs, voice transcription, all sorts of techniques allow us to actually capture that knowledge and actually be able to use it, store it, and then retrieve it. Here's why that's so important. The business rules, for example, that govern what happens when something doesn't work the way you expected is almost always tacit knowledge. Now, if you have a very richly governed organization, maybe that's not the case. But in many cases, some of that knowledge around what to do if this occurs or if that occurs is stuck in people's heads. We've had great success where we interview people and we capture that interview, whether in a transcript or audio or video, but being able to process that information is crucial. Now, here's the second source. I know from my experience, whenever we did a project, we'd create a requirements document, a specification, all sorts of rich information that at that point in time explain what the project is. Far too often, what I've seen, at least in the past, is we would store that requirements document. And once we implemented the system, it was gone. It was never there again. Here's the thing. You spent months, at least in the olden days, you spent months creating that content, that rich
And you
content.
put it on
It
a
happened to be
massive SharePoint site. Yes, I can.
Yeah, and you never use it
I'm having
again.
flashbacks of massive SharePoint sites for intergalactic sized programs, and it evolves so many times that people forget there's a whole directory tree of knowledge that, yeah, this was the program 6 months ago or 12 months ago, and then we decided to reorganize everything. So, dude, you're creating knowledge management PTSD, I think, by
Well,
talking
it
about it.
reminds you of some of the engagements we had at global banks in the past, does it not?
Yes, oy vey.
Yeah, but here's the thing. Now that we've figured out where the content is, and maybe it's in some form that we can use, we ingest that. But again, what we want to do is decompose that into the concept cards and the policy cards. So we use our vocabulary, our taxonomy, our ontology to classify this information into concepts that provide, as rich a definition as you possibly can. And because it's digital, some of these descriptions can be extremely detailed. Same thing for policy cards. So once we have those, obviously we're going to store them. The second piece of the puzzle, the online piece, is how does an agent actually consume that knowledge? So typically, an agent gets a request in a form of a prompt, for example. And the first thing it does is that goes to the, it looks, if you're using Claude Code, for example, or even Codex, it looks at the skill that may be appropriate for that request. And it uses that skill to identify which concept cards and which policy cards are most relevant, gets those, does a token-aware analysis. And this is the crucial part that differentiates from regular knowledge management. We're explicitly setting this up for serving context in a token-aware fashion. By the way, that doesn't mean you can't use it for other purposes. But that skill gives us enough information to get the policy cards, the concept cards. And then what we need to do is triage that to the most relevant within a token-aware budget. That token-aware budget is what we call the minimum viable context. That is the minimum viable information that agent needs to actually do its job. We provide that to the agent, and it's actually able to do its request, fulfill its request in the most effective fashion.
So you've literally just walked us left to right across that whole visual for the process. Now, I just checked again on the slide, and I know there were a couple of things you might want to come back to, like skill.md that's sort of sticking out in that slide. But but let me ask you a different question, because yes, you can come back to that. I just think that the era we're in, which I mean is, what is it, March of 2026. This is how we're thinking about it. I can't help realizing that this is going to look like a toy in 2027. But what is important about this visualization of how we're thinking about it today is, and this is what I like about your book, is you're great at abstracting the key concepts at the point in time that you need them. And I think this is a very thorough framework, and I'm already thinking of 5 ways to break it. So I'm not going to break it yet on the podcast, but I love where we're going, because if you're new to AI and AI agents, one of the things that you can benefit by listening to Eric and I go through this is that we thought about it a lot. We've done a lot of work. We've built a lot of systems. Doesn't mean we figured anything out. It means that we advance the terrain, or, we're breaking trail and describing it in the way us two would describe it. And I think what I find fascinating about this podcast, Eric, is that we get to share the way we're thinking about it and then get reaction. And I would encourage people that are listening to us, and as we pontificate about how we've been designing our systems right now, like we're building systems based on this thinking. But we know that these systems are going to have to be rebuilt in 6 to 12 months, because we're going to have other ways to frame it. So I just, maybe that's the caveat for everything we do, is that the rate of acceleration of the discussion is continuing. And yeah, I just feel it's important for everybody listening to us to hear that, because this is going to continue to evolve, and it's important to get these fundamentals under your belt so that you can join the conversation as we go to the next and the next and the next iteration. Sorry, I was
Yeah.
having a lot of thought
No,
about our
no.
podcast these days. Anyway,
No, no, I think it's actually exactly the right thing. So let me kind of just
yeah,
add a little bit of color to that commentary. First off, I agree 100%. Second of all, if you the folks who are listening or watching our podcasts have probably recognized the fact that we're focusing on the architecture.
yeah,
If you're looking at about, how to build agents, there's other better places to go. But if you're looking
yeah,
for how to do architecture at scale for agents, this is where you come to. This is one example where we illustrate how the general architecture is going to work in abstract terms: ingestion, compilation, serving, and all the components that I mentioned.
yeah,
That process may not change, but there is one we did. So that's why we rarely show code. But as you're probably going to point out, we do show the skill.md.
yeah. I know, it's
Today,
dude. It's like,
today, March 2026, Claude Code, Cowork, OpenAI supports skills also. That seems to be today the de
yeah,
facto approach. But here's the thing: whether it's skills.md or somebody really soups up MCP, or there's another solution that comes out, the fact of the matter is we need to decompose that request that comes in the best fashion that we possibly can, into the concept cards and the policy cards that are necessary. Today, the skill.md is a rich markdown file that gives you more or less all the information, we think, all the information in a format that is suitable for LLMs, in particular some of the modern LLMs, to actually consume and use that as the primary way of gauging what you need to get out of the Agentic Knowledge Fabric. So yes, at the expense of showing a point in time technology, we thought it was particularly relevant right now to highlight that.
I know you're flexing with your MD file. Okay, well, good. So, is there more to say, or should we park it there? Where do we want to take the discussion next before we wrap?
Um, I don't know if I have a heck of a lot to add, to be honest with you. I
Okay,
think we
good.
covered the bottom line. Anything you see that we might have missed, John?
I want to make these as ideas for future podcasts. Okay. So the one that comes to mind, it keeps occurring to me every few episodes, is that context engineering is changing so fast that I think we need to do a history of context engineering just to remind ourselves how far we've come since, November of 2022, right? There were
I know.
specific events in our common history where we leveled up on context engineering, and we've
I
come a long way.
I like that idea, although I'd be pretty scared to tell
Yeah.
people how we used to do this stuff in the old days.
Nah, dude, but I think
Shortly after ChatGPT came out and RAG was all the rage.
I
But
don't know, but
great
I
topic,
think,
great idea, great topic.
yeah, because I think one of the things we are doing is we're chronicling history of the evolution of this agentic mesh. We don't know what it's going to look like. You've put a stake in the ground with a great book that architecturally is super relevant, and that's what I love about it. And that's why we have the podcast, because we know that these things are evolving very quickly. So anyway, history of context engineering one. Second one, and this is going to be interesting. And there's two angles to it, but I'll start with the easy one. Multimodal. Okay. We have been implicit, maybe explicit. I think we've been implicitly focused on language models because that's, dude, there's enough in there for language models and the conversations we've been having. Yet, we all know, and we've seen it for a couple of years, the quality of multimodal processing in models. And what we mean, and I'll just tell you what I mean, is like in the image recognition space, it used to be that you would apply an OCR algorithm and that would do high quality text to or image to text, and then you would try to make sense of the text. Well, that was the olden days. Now, the API call for the model is so good that it's actually much higher performing, more tokens, but way higher performing. If you just present the image and say, tell me everything you know about it, it can infer way more than you ever thought it could because the whatever it is, the latent knowledge space and vector representation of images and words are somehow being captured inside the model. So multimodal is already changing everything.
Yeah, no, I think you're
So
spot on. I'll give you an example where I have seen uh, how folks may use this. So take an interview. When you're
yeah,
interviewing somebody, if you look at the transcript, you don't get the vocal intonations where there's
intonations. Yeah, no,
stress.
that's perfect. Yeah,
Right. And here's the thing, that's the audio side. When you actually
yeah.
are able to add the video side, you can see the facial expressions, which sometimes are as important. So I strongly agree for certain industries, certain segments, multimodal is going to generate a wealth of information.
Well, yeah, and getting to audio, dude, I was at a meetup, and here, shout out to the Data Management Association of San Francisco that's just sort of rebooting. I went to their meetup a few Sundays ago, and dude, there was a guy from Apple talking about audio engineering, and I'm like, oh my goodness, the the depth and sophistication and thought, like everything we think we know, or everything we've learned about LLMs in the language space is also true. Like there's just so much depth of thinking around the audio engineering process and pulling signal out.
Well, perhaps lesson learned here is we're finding we're scraping the earliest,
Yeah.
the most shallow pieces of the audio side, let alone the video side,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
even there, incredible use cases. Um,
Well, and
John,
yeah.
go ahead.
Uh, were you going to wrap? I've got one other thread,
Yeah,
one
go for it.
string to
Go for
pull.
it.
Okay. The last string, and it's related to the multimodal discussion, but it goes to the broader discussion of world models. I'll just say world models and stop, because that's where I feel the convergence of the multimodal. And I'm not going to even pretend I know what the best and latest current thinking is on world models, but that's where we ultimately will get to. And let's not pretend we're there or have anything. I
Yeah.
don't have anything
I,
useful to say about that
well, I
right
don't
now.
want to. So let's not set expectations that we're going to talk
Yeah.
about world models next
No, no,
week, but
no,
definitely
no.
something in the future, my friend.
Right. Okay. Cool. Well, I think we've drained it. I'm good. How are you feeling?
I'm good.
Good?
I think it's a wrap, my friend.
Okay. So tune in next time when we pick apart another aspect of the agentic mesh, how we're seeing it evolve, and what we can share with our audience. Thanks for listening.